Reflections on the Good News of Jesus Christ for the 15th Sunday of Ordinary Time from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus summoned the 12 and began to send them out two by two and gave them authority over unclean spirits. He instructed them to take nothing for the journey but a walking stick, no food, no sack, no money in their belts. They were, however, to wear sandals, but not a second tunic. He said to them, "Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave. Whatever place does not welcome you or listen to you, leave there and shake the dust off your feet in testimony against them." So they went off and preached repentance. The 12 drove out many demons, and they anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. The Gospel of the Lord. She begins her program with Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. Her fingers dance over the frets of her guitar with the quiet confidence of her years of practice and study. She next plays an Irish air, then a Bob Dylan folk song, and finally a jazz improvisation of her own creation. She performs for an audience of one, a 70-year-old woman dying of cancer. The venue, the dying woman's room at the local hospice. Music is her ministry, providing a measure of peace and tranquility for those taking the last steps from this world into eternity. Most spring and summer evenings, as soon as he gets home from the office, he heads to his small garden behind the garage. This quarter acre is one of his favorite places on earth. He grows tomatoes, beans, and corn. He saves a few things for his own family. He shares the rest of the harvest of the good earth with needy families served by the local soup kitchen and food pantry. She suffered from bulimia as a teenager. Thanks to her wise and caring family, she overcame this devastating disease. Now a mother herself, she read about a support group for girls suffering from eating disorders. Every week, she is there. She says very little. She is present to listen and to support. And when asked one-on-one by a girl who is terrified at what is happening to her, she offers the hope of her own story. With their particular gifts and charisms, guitar music, vegetable seeds, their own stories and experiences, these three, and so many more like them, realize that Christ has sent them forth, like the 12 in today's gospel, to be his instruments of peace, apostles of compassion, ministers of healing. In today's gospel, the 12, each of whom has been called personally by Jesus, are given the title of apostle, one who is sent. These unlikely candidates for such a task, probably none of whom would today pass the entrance requirements for admission to a seminary, are carefully prepared and taught by Jesus for this moment. They undertake their first preaching and healing tour, depending only on God for their inspiration and on the charity of others for their needs. Remember that hospitality was considered a sacred responsibility in the East. It was not up to the stranger to seek hospitality, but up to the prospective host to offer it. With no McDonald's or 7-Eleven close at hand, travelers were forced to rely on others. And it would be unthinkable to refuse hospitality to a stranger. What a different world we live in today. Jesus instructs those whom he sends to travel light, to focus on the journey and the ministry with which they have been entrusted, not with accumulating wealth, status, or power. What else should they leave behind? Not even think about taking with them so that they will not be burdened on this journey? Old grudges, distracting ambitions, closed-mindedness. Leave them all behind. The excess trappings of power, privilege, money, their rigid ideologies or pet theories, leave them all behind too. They will only make the journey more difficult. Jesus tells them to go out 2 by 2, for safety's sake, among other reasons, and drive out unclean spirits. What are these unclean spirits? Sometimes it seems that it really was an evil influence, a demon, if you like, which controlled a person's life, what he said or what she did. But in those days, there were many manifestations which people did not fully understand. These, for want of a better explanation, were attributed to demonic influences, even possessions. For instance, there were some sicknesses which people thought were due to the influence of a devil. A clear example is the story of the epileptic boy healed by Jesus. In an epileptic fit, a seemingly normal person suddenly begins to act in a bizarre way, as if controlled by an outside force. It was a long time before people began to understand the physiological and neurological malfunctions in the brain that are the cause of epilepsy. There would be similar misunderstandings of people who were mentally disturbed in various ways, psychotic behavior, schizophrenia, and so forth, or people who had some brain damage but were otherwise of perfectly normal intelligence, for example, people with cerebral palsy. Most of us have probably never seen a genuinely possessed person. But in our own time, there are many other kinds of demons which can control people when people become the slaves of these things. There is the demon of nicotine, or alcohol, or other drugs, the demon of gambling, the demon of promiscuous sex, the demon of materialism and consumerism, or any other activity which somehow takes control of our lives. All of these, or any one of them, can turn us into slaves. They rob us of our freedom. We need the help of Jesus and one another to liberate us from these things. Jesus today is inviting us to cooperate with him. He wants us to be his instruments of liberation, to help others recover their freedom, and, where necessary, to recover our own. We are called to work with Jesus to help people to cure their sicknesses, not only bodily sicknesses, but psychological and emotional illnesses as well. It is not only doctors and nurses who can bring healing. A family member, a friend, a colleague, various kinds of support groups, any caring person can bring healing. For us as Christians, it is a calling that comes with baptism. When I was a youngster attending Catholic schools, part of the daily routine was to pray for vocations, meaning, of course, priests, sisters, and brothers. We would have been amazed then to see how few priests, sisters, and brothers we have now. What is this saying? Does God not answer prayers? No, I think God answers every prayer in one way or another. And God is answering our prayer for vocations by reminding us, as the Second Vatican Council has taught, that every one of us has a vocation. It comes with baptism. It may be a vocation to the married life or the single life, to the ordained or professed life. But for all of us, it is a vocation to make the reign of God a greater reality in any way we can. How is each of us living that vocation? Now, you may be thinking, that's not what I signed up for. You may also have noticed that living in such a way that the reign of God becomes more real does not always get you a round of applause. As we learn from the prophet Amos, the priest Amaziah told Amos to take his prophesying and go back to his own country. They didn't want him to listen in Bethel. They didn't want him there at all. They didn't want him to preach. They certainly didn't want to listen. And Amos replies that it was not his idea to become a prophet. He was a simple shepherd and a tender of trees. Nevertheless, the Lord chose him and told him to prophesy to the people of Israel. Perhaps you can sympathize with his feelings. After all, you might be saying, I am only a housewife, or a clerk, or a banker, or a factory worker, or a student, or a teacher, or whatever. But because I have been baptized, Jesus is calling me in my working and living environment to bring good news to the poor, to invite people through my example to know him, to love him, to serve him, to follow him. And I can be sure I will not always get a warm hearing. But let me share this thought. When my faith is merely religion, nothing happens. But when faith becomes a passion, people change, beginning, of course, with myself. People are challenged not by you or me, but by the message we live. And most of all, by the Spirit of Jesus working through us. Far more important than what we say or teach is the message of our lives. As someone once said, I'd rather see a sermon lived than preached. What sermon is the Spirit of Jesus calling you to live this week? Thanks for listening.